Hello and welcome to Vera Voices. I'm Michael Jacobson, Vera's director, and we're here today with Tom Tyler, a professor of psychology and law at the Yale Law School. And we're here today to talk to Professor Tyler about his work in procedural justice and legitimacy and its relationship to policing on terrorism. Welcome and thank you so much for doing this. Why don't we start off with how your work or your recommendations in terms of policing for counterterrorism differ from the dominant mode of policing that you see?
I think that we have a tendency when we face a threat, like the threat of terrorism, to try to control that threat by an intrusive police presence into communities that we think might be supportive of terrorist activities. My argument is that it's very important to identify threats, but that a better way to do that is to seek the active cooperation of a community, in this case with terror, the Muslim American community. If that's our goal, then we need to ask, how do we get cooperation? How do we get police legitimacy? And that's where my research on procedural justice comes in. If the police consult with the community when they're developing policies, if they enact their policies on the street in ways that people experience as fair, they're viewed as legitimate, and they're going to get the cooperation that I argue is really a better way to identify threats than a kind of top-down authoritarian approach.
Okay, and that both makes intuitive sense, but also, as you said, some of the sort of empirical basis for this comes out of work you did with Muslim communities in New York and in London. So why don't you talk a little, in a little finer detail about what that work entailed and what some of the findings were specifically.
What we did is we interviewed samples of Muslims living in New York City and London. The goal was to understand why those individuals would or would not cooperate with the police. So the research that we did simply looked at why people expressed that willingness. What are the factors that shaped whether they were or were not willing to go to the police to report threats? And that's where we get the argument that procedural justice matters. I mean, there are really two arguments here. One is a lot of the things that we think might be different about this minority community are not the key factors. The fact that people might be religious Muslims, that does not matter in terms of whether they will cooperate. The fact that they might have grievances about national policy with America, that's not a relevant factor. They are focused on the issue of how the police treat people in their community. And that's a hook for the police. That means that if the police do in fact take these research findings seriously and focus on fairness as it's understood in the community, they can actually motivate cooperation.
Right, very interesting. And in terms of procedural justice and legitimacy, is it essentially the same mode of policing that you would do for non-terrorism policing would work equally well in this case Muslim communities, or is there some variant of that for counterterrorism policing?
Originally, our work was directed at policing in minority communities against crime. So African Americans, Hispanics, ordinary crime, where there's not an ideology issue, there's not a religious issue. And that's where we first found that legitimacy is central to both obeying the law and cooperating with the police. That legitimacy comes out of a sense of procedural justice. That is, many people might think that instrumental factors like will I be punished, or is there some reward in this for me, drive behavior, but we consistently find that it's really the sense that the authorities do or don't act fairly in the community. So this first, that being true in minority communities, is something that was established before terrorism became an issue in America. Then the question, as you said, is does this extend to a different kind of crime, a different kind of criminal, and a different kind of community that might support that person? And basically the answer is the findings are all the same.
Let me play a little bit of a devil's advocate, at least in the New York context, right? So there'd be some who'd say, clearly the NYPD does a variety of things. I don't think anyone would say in counterterrorism policing, it's doing this kind of policing. Yet there haven't been any terrorist incidents since 9/11, there's been a variety of arrests and cases made, and so some might ask, well, what's wrong with the current method?
I think we're both extraordinarily happy that there have not been terror incidents in New York and hope it stays that way. But the issue of why that's true is not one that I think we have a very clear answer to.
What's your sense about how much attention police departments sort of generally will pay to this? And again, either in the American context or in terms of your research in the UK context.
There's been a lot of attention to these research findings in America in the context of local policing. The Department of Justice, the cops office have made efforts to build training programs and to articulate these ideas to police chiefs. Chicago is a really striking example. They're doing a major rollout of procedural justice training for police officers. The UK is another example. The police have really embraced a lot of these ideas. So we can definitely see some places where this is having a big effect. You know, not everywhere. I don't think we've had a big effect, for example, on the NYPD. I think we've had a lot more success in discussions about local policing issues like street stops, racial profiling, what to do about immigrant status stops. Terrorism and the effort to contain terrorism seems to be being treated by people as a separate issue. I think my whole theme would be that terrorism is not different than any other crime, yet we see in the federal response to terrorism a lot of differentiation of anti-terror policing from other kinds of policing, and a separation of the community that's doing that from typical police communities. That makes it hard to reach those people, to convince them, to talk to them, but I do think that we have a lot to say to them, so I hope we can find some ways to make those connections.
It's a very powerful research and really important findings, and we hope that as well. And thank you again for coming.
Absolutely.